In my previous video on relationship astrology, I introduced you to the 7 shapes that planets make in Synastric geometry. Today, in this video, I want to show you how to identify which of those shapes are the most important in any given couple's Synastric chart. So here's a graphic of what I offer in my relationship compatibility report, which you can get at my site, which is linked down below. So this shows you the basic compatibility score for each of the shapes formed between each of the planets on the couple's charts. Okay, so for example, this is for my wife and I. So our ascendants are 100% compatibility score because they're a pole, they're 7 signs apart. Our Marses, they are 11 signs apart, right? So that forms the half of a trine. And that's about 60% compatibility. So this is just a list of all those scores. And then in this smaller section below that, there's the shapes formed between different planets. So like my ascendant to my wife's Mars is quincunx. They're 8 or 6 signs apart. So that's a 20% compatibility. Right? And my ascendant to her moon is square. So that's a 0% compatibility. My ascendant to her Venus is trine. Right? So that's handy because this is a complete list of all the compatibility scores that are at work in your relationship compatibility from the viewpoint of Synastric geometry. However, the really interesting thing, because the theme of today's video is how do you know which of these shapes is the really significant one? You know that by what I call the weight of the shape. So if you look carefully at each of these bars, there's this little WT colon. So, for example, up here at the top, our ascendants are 7 signs apart, and that's a 100% compatibility score, but the weight of this is only 23%. Whereas the Marses, they're 11 signs apart, which is less of a compatibility score, but the weight of that one is 97%. So now let me share with you a bit about how I get that weight. How do I calculate the weight of a shape? After last week's video, a lot of you seem to have the misconception that I was talking about aspects between planets, because in Western astrology, they use these shapes to describe the aspects, and that's how you interpret the aspects according to the shape. But that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the relationship between the signs. However, the tighter the alignment to the actual shape, the more weighty that shape will be in the relationship. So let me give you an example or two to explain how this works. So in my relationship with my wife, the least weighty shape formed between our planets is the one between my Ketu and her Saturn. So let's take a look at this. If we look at the bi-wheel, my planets are on the inside. So we find my Ketu, it's there in Virgo. So now where's her Saturn? Her Saturn is going to be the Saturn on the outside. So that's in Cancer, right? By the signs, this is half of a trine. It's 3 signs away or 11 signs away, right? My Ketu is in Virgo, that's 1. Then there's Leo in between, then there's Cancer. So there's 3 signs between my Ketu in Virgo and her Saturn in Cancer. So we should be getting a semi-sextile shape. However, look where my Ketu is. It's at the very beginning of Virgo. It's really close to the beginning of Virgo. And look where her Saturn is. It's really close to the end of Cancer. So it's not like aspects where you say, well, this is out of orb, so this thing doesn't exist at all. But what you do is you detract from the weight. And I can't explain the exact math because, well, the exact math looks something like this. So all you have to do is subtract the degrees of planet A from the degrees of planet B, and then compare it to the maximum. So in other words, my Ketu is 3 degrees Virgo, but hers is at 28 Cancer. So you subtract those 2 numbers and take away the sign. So it's 25 degrees difference. Mine's at 3, hers is at 28. So there's 25 degrees difference from the perfect shape that we're talking about here. So then you'd say 30 degrees is the maximum where we can even consider it to be like this shape. After 30 degrees, it changes to the next shape. So 30 degrees is the maximum. If something is 30 degrees out of alignment, it's 0% weight. And if something is 0 degrees out of alignment, exactly aligned, then it's 100%. And you just do a linear ratio. And then you'll get the weight. So that's how you do it with math. And maybe you love math, and so you're really thrilled. But maybe you hate math, and you think it's just slows down your intuition. You don't have to do the math part either. You could just use your eyes. You just look for the alignments that are pretty close to exact. Let's use our Marses, because it's a very fun word to say in plural, Marses. So let's find the two Marses to begin with. Mine is in Leo. You see it on the inner wheel right next to the sun in Leo, early Leo. And hers is in Gemini. Now you don't have to do math here, but you know that my Mars is in early Leo, hers is in early Gemini, so whatever shape they form has to be pretty weighty because they're both in the early areas of their signs. Now I'll give you another example how to do this by eye. Her Saturn is towards the end of Cancer, right? So it doesn't really align very well with my Ketu, which is at the beginning of Virgo, but it does align a lot more with my Venus, that's getting closer to the end, but even more with my Jupiter, which is almost exactly the same distance from the end of Libra as Saturn is from the end of Cancer. Now this is where it's not the same thing as aspects. My K2, if it was an aspect, then my K2 to her Saturn would be close in orb to 30 degrees or semisextile. But we're not purely talking about the angle between the two planets. We're talking about the angle of the signs that the planets occupy. So we're not going to say his Ketu and her Saturn are out of orb for a sextile, but they're in orb for a semisextile. Because one's in Virgo and the other one is in Cancer. So they're locked into that sign relationship shape, which is sextile, but we say that this is very out of orb, let's say, or the intensity of this alignment is very low. Like let's say if you have one planet at the beginning of Aries and another planet at the end of Cancer. So geometrically speaking, for aspects, that's really strong trine. To have one planet at the beginning of Aries and another planet at the end of Cancer. But when we're dealing with synastry geometry, we're not just purely talking about the planets, we're talking about the geometry of the signs that the planets occupy. Planet A is in Aries, planet B is in Cancer. Those two signs, Aries and Cancer, have a 90-degree or square relationship to each other. If one is at the very beginning of Aries and the other is at the very end of Cancer, it doesn't make it a strong trine, it makes it a weak square. That's the difference between what we're doing here and what is commonly done in modern Western aspect evaluation. Now when you're looking for that sameness shape, the conjunction shape, it's super easy, right? You can just obviously see, there's a very weighty or intense conjunction between her Sun and his K2, and her Venus and his K2, and her Mars and his Moon. Okay, so the idea then is you can just kind of make a list, rather literally make a list or just do it quickly in your intuitive head, of the alignments between the planets that are the most exact, and you prioritize those. These are the ones that this couple needs to know about, or if it's you, these are the ones that I need to think about in my relationship before I think about these other ones that are very unweighty. The unweighty, unintense shapes formed in a synastry chart will still say something about your relationship, but it's much more important that you understand the weighty ones first because they have more weight in your relationship. So in the previous video, I introduced you to what the shapes were and what they basically signify. In this video, I showed you how to sort out which ones are important and which ones are less important. In the next video, let's start looking at some examples of how to interpret these things. So thank you very much. Stick around. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss these. See you next time.